Hi, I'm Jeff Craig. I'm the lead designer at Wargaming here on World of Tanks for the console and soon World of Tanks Modern Armor.
Hi, I'm Andy DeRizis. I'm one of the lead artists on World of Tanks console.
So you guys talk about what going to the Cold War to a more like modern time opened up for your team creatively?
Sure. Sorry. We're talking from work from home, and for some reason I thought there was more to that question, so that's my bad. Honestly, we've been working on World of Tanks console since 2014, I think, or even before that, right? But that's when it launched, and its bread and butter has been in roughly what we call World War II, a little bit before, a little bit after, but that age of tech and abilities and gameplay is very much line of sight based and thickness of armor based. Oversimplification, but you know what I mean. And as soon as you get into the more modern armor, and in the Cold War and in the late 20th century, the methodology of making tanks and conventional warfare in terms of how to stop your troops from dying and how to win a battle changed pretty dramatically with the advent of more advanced weapon systems and armor systems. And it was our job to try to keep the meaty, awesome nugget of World of Tanks console, but stay true and honest to the historical evolution of all those techs. And that was a really fun challenge, and I think it's going to be really exciting to play.
From an artist perspective, you can talk about how you drew these tanks and created these tanks. Did you? I know we had COVID this last year, but did you go to any like military bases and look at tanks and take pictures yourself? Did you just look at reference online? Like, talk about your process.
Absolutely. So we have historians actually in the part of the world where a lot of the tanks are being fielded currently, and that are still in museums. If they've just been taken out of service or are in for service. Even our historians kind of live in those countries. So we couldn't as artists go out and do that, but they could, and they did. They were going out to military museums on the sly and getting into different facilities to get pictures of these things. Not to mention the fact that we're using the same kind of historians that we use on the PC. So the level of access to knowledge in the tank world that they have is kind of beyond anything that we may even have in the States in some cases, unless you have some kind of governmental access. But in the end, we were using tons and tons of reference, and our sister studio in Kiev that was building most of the tanks for us, they were going hard and deep on getting access to information, even asking us for information, trying to get access to secret information, because some of these countries are currently using these tank platforms, these weapons platforms, and getting the information for weapons and for weapon systems and for the ERA and armor thicknesses can be actually interesting. It's a little wild, but yeah, I mean, has COVID slowed us down? Not much, actually, on the tank and art side, because we are being very resourceful. A lot of the information is out there. We just have to get at it. So, and we are.
So Jeff, from a design perspective, is it difficult to kind of balance? Because obviously, like, the console version is a little more like of a game, not as much so as like a war simulator, right? Because there are hardcore war simulators out there that are insane. But this is more of an arcadey kind of feel. Is it difficult when you're adding different takes and different generations of warfare to make sure that they all have their own strengths and weaknesses in their own way, and so they're not like, so the newer tanks just don't dominate the older ones, that kind of stuff?
That was a challenge. Actually, we did consider for a while just letting everybody play with everybody, but then at the end of the day, it wasn't aligning with the goals, and honestly, it probably wouldn't have been fun. Like, if you're in an M1A2 Abrams versus like a Sherman, if you lose as the Abrams, I think we did our jobs wrong, right? Like, that thing is way exponentially more advanced. To your point about the console game, we are definitely not a sim. Like, if you want a sim, the camera that's third person behind looking at your tank, like, you ain't gonna get that, right? You're gonna be inside this for quite some time. Like I was alluding to before, and one of our jobs is to make sure that everything that was and currently is cool about the game as it is right now, as people are playing it while you and I are talking, is preserved and expanded upon with the Cold War technology advancements, not replaced or subverted in any way. So that was actually a little more of a challenge, because it's relatively easy it's harder to make the decision on whether or not it's right for the game as opposed to actually doing it on who or which tanks can fight which tanks. Is this the right choice for the game? That part is easy, but making sure it's like, does this still play like the players expect and is inviting to new players, but is fulfilling the promise of these new modern armor tanks, new to our game, Cold War, late 20th century for history, and is it scratching the itch? Like Andy said, some of these tanks are being used by militaries right now, and that makes it very understandable for like, well, how does this operate? They're like, well, we're not going to tell you. And some of our players have likely served in these tanks, right? Like a guy in the game industry that I worked under, he was a driver for an Abrams. I honestly don't remember which model, but like now I know he's breathing down my neck like, this better be good, dude. And I'm like, awesome. And that's actually really exciting. That's a cool responsibility to have.
And you guys still do take to account, like, you know, like reload times, movement speeds, weight, like even the length of the turrets on the tanks themselves to, like, you know, try to make it as realistic as you can for the console version. Can you talk about that process?
Sure. I think actually both Andy and I can touch that. I'll give the gameplay, game design side, and then he could talk about like either the freedoms or limits that might impose on art. Like some of the really easy to describe very quick things is like gun depression. Part of the reason like a lot of guns and where you are horizontally on the ground matters is the gun doesn't just stop at the turret, right? There's a bunch of infrastructure within the turret that lets you reload and aim and so on and so forth. So that's why you can't aim the gun down, depress it as much as you may think you can, even if you rotate the turret to the side. And all of that is modeled on the Insider as well, right? So that we had to make sure we got right for all of our new tanks in the Cold War eras in the modern armor. That's a really easy thing to describe that I think people get. And another thing that actually we had to wrap our heads around, Andy also alluded to, the modernization of the armor systems. In World War II, essentially, not I mean, I'm being reductionist, but essentially more steel, more thickness, sharper angle, more protection. Now, when you get into the Cold War, you start getting into composites and really advanced armor, and it's not so much about like the literal distance of armor between you and the deadly impact of whatever was shot at you, but the layering of different materials that is specifically designed, or the explosive reactive armor in the case of like heat rounds. That required us to think about things differently, as opposed to, well, make the number bigger, right? Because it's not always about a bigger number. It's like, well, what materials are interacting with what offensive round? And we had to make sure we did a lot of due diligence with that. Andy, about what about the art? Is there anything specific that were challenges or benefits from that?
Sure. I mean, with all tanks, I mean, we were always taking into account the weight and the suspension travel and all of those things, how fast the gun rotates. But we're also taking into account, you know, are they using some kind of crazy paint on the tank? Is there some kind of, you know, radar defeat system or anything like that? We're trying to make sure that we're covering all of our bases when it comes to the actual hardware and anti-weapon systems that they may have on board. That was a huge thing. I mean, we were going back and forth with optics and like, what are we going to add to this particular rev of the tank? Because they fielded it with these 3 different types of optic systems. We have to pick one, you know, that kind of thing. The amount of technology built into these tanks is vastly superior to what we were dealing in World War II. It's not just a simple, you know, metal hull with a backup, you know, crank for the turret if it goes down. I mean, we're talking about, we know for the fact that these turrets can spin super fast. We know that they have all these systems built in. So we have to actually like go out of our way to make sure that we're not only are we modeling that into the design of how we're tweaking these tanks, but actually how they look. So, you know, we're making sure that there's 2 bolts on the top of the turret. Why is that there? Oh, because there's a really, really important system behind there. And there's also supposed to be a metal plate there. And if you don't put that there, someone can actually penetrate there and kill the entire crew by setting off the magazine, you know, that kind of stuff. It's like super, super, super important on modern tanks, specifically because there are new loading hatches on the tops of tanks to load armaments instead of just putting it through the cupola, you know, like in World War II. They're just loading it through a hatch. Now there's totally different systems that are involved with making sure we're modeling armor behind all that stuff on the game side, but actually showing the armor as well on the outside.
Another thing
not
that's really
showing
quick.
it, but showing the systems there to show that it's there. It's kind of hard to explain, but that part, as far as like the way governments like or systems engineers designing these tanks like to hide this stuff, especially hiding it from us when we're trying to tell what the hell is supposed to be there in the first place, and no one's telling us because it's secret. It's pretty neat.
Recently, I was actually fixing a bug in one of the Abrams tanks, and if you can see on the turret, there's that railing on the turret in the rear part of the turret, and like even because we have tank designers and tank artists that are dealing with all these day to day while I'm trying to make or empower smart people to make fun games. I was trying to fix a bug just to save some bandwidth, and I noticed all of that railing on that Abrams is all modeled and has all sorts of tuning values associated with it. So if the shell actually impacts that railing before passing between one of those gaps to hit the armor plate behind it, it'll interact differently. So I was like, wow, that's super cool.
Do you guys talk about, like, obviously as you get more, it's in World War II era and a little bit after, like nobody, supposedly cares because, they're decommissioned tanks, they're old technology, no one uses them anymore. But like, as you get more to modern stuff, like you said, people start using them more. So can you talk about like kind of the pushback you get if you maybe want a certain tank in the game and a government is like, well, we don't want you to know how thick that armor is. We don't want you to know how long that barrel is. We don't want you to know how fast it takes to reload, like all that stuff that maybe they feel is confidential, even though the tank is still pretty old.
I can tell you a little bit about one tiny little instance we just discovered. I can't tell you which tank it is, but we were actually going to call a tank a specific name, and we find out that it's actually copyrighted because it's currently owned by a government, and it's being fielded by a government and owned by a company. So we have to be a little careful with that kind of stuff. As far as pushback that we get, the biggest pushback we get are from I'd say vets, that have played these tanks, that know about this stuff, especially with other tanks. Another tank, unfortunately, I can't mention that's coming, but we know somebody that in our studio that literally was in the tank, and he's like, no, this is totally wrong. What you're doing is wrong. Fix this right now. And we were like, okay, sorry, we'll fix it right now. It came even down, I think, to the sound of the tank, that we had something a little off, and he's like, doesn't sound right. Okay, now it sounds right. We're a little nuts like that when it comes to the tank. I think the history of the tanks as well is when we have a lot of vets that play our game, it's actually really, really important to us that they sound, look, and act like they originally did.
Yeah, really, that's what wargaming is about, right? You guys are all about, that's their whole like shtick, is be very as accurate as you possibly can be in the game in terms of representation. Right.
Yeah, we count bolts, and we still do it. I'm counting bolts every day on tanks when I'm looking at tanks, and it goes through about 4 different verifications for accuracy before they even start building it. Just the reference does. And then it goes back and forth between our 2 offices before we start building it. It gets signed off on, the reference gets signed off on, and then we actually go through the process of starting to make it. And I'm going back and forth with all the reference, making sure that their welding panels on properly. We got the proper like grip tape on surfaces for guys' feet so they don't slide off of different places on the tank. It gets pretty nuts, down to cotter pins being in the proper location on certain rods sticking through holes of things. It's pretty nuts.
Yeah, and it's also one of the terms I like to do is or say is we're historically accurate. We're not historically literal, and what I mean by that is like when you're playing on one of these, although this is an Xbox 360 controller, that's old school, excuse me, from our launch. When you're playing on a controller, there's some concessions we have to make to, and even a keyboard and mouse, right? It wouldn't matter, like it's not a sim. So when we come to decisions on like this tank needs another upgrade to be meaningful, or in order to balance against the other tanks, maybe the rotation rate needs to be slightly different, or the reload rate needs to be slightly different, because that balance of making sure that the responsibility that we have as developers is met by the players. If they're like, oh, I have this tank, I recognize this tank, it's cool, and it gets better as I progress in this tank and invest in this tank my time to unlock cool stuff. That's always a balance. And we've actually, there's some features we've talked about even just like different ways to intercept enemy ordnance, of what is literal versus what is fun, and then what is correct for the game. And those are often 3 very distinct things. I especially with some of my history, tend to go a little bit magical on the concept phase. And what I mean by that, I'd be like, it'd be cool if you hit a button and all enemy shells being fired at you just explode. It's like a force field. And then like smart designers will be like, nothing like that exists, not even now, let alone the Cold War. Let's see if we can get you what you want in a real, like, here's like the Storta 1, here's different reactive armor systems that actually exist. Is this meeting the same goals? And I actually really enjoy those kind of conversations, because I think that limited canvas, as I call it, makes for some really unique, fun gameplay, and is honestly why World of Tanks is special and stands out in my mind. Is those restrictions or the onus of making sure that we're correct and still wanting to make those fun interactive elements and features puts us through a little more internal scrutiny, and I really enjoy that.